Okay. Hello and welcome to the OECD Education and Skills special webinar series, which is a question and answer series on the PISA 2015 results, which were published today a week ago. This special session we have Andreas Schleicher, Director for the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills and Head of the PISA program since its inception in 2000, and also Alfonso Echara, who is a Senior PISA Analyst, who will be available to answer your questions. This webinar will look specifically at the PISA findings and what factors contribute to closing the achievement gap and improving education outcomes for all students. So I will hand you over to Andreas, and during his presentation, you may post questions via the chat function. Andreas?
Opportunity that we want to offer you to discuss our work, and I'm going to just highlight some of the main results from the PISA assessment. As a reminder, here you see a map of the countries that we are currently covering. It's a fairly large group of 72 countries and economies that are joining the assessment. The first thing everybody, of course, is asking about how well education systems do. Overall, we often look at the ranking of countries or their performance on average. But it's equally important to also look at the achievement gap, the impact that social background has on the quality of learning outcomes. And this is where we find countries when we measure both the performance of education systems on the vertical axis and the capacity of systems to leverage the talent of all people on the horizontal axis. Every education system wants to be in the upper right corner, where performance is strong and outcomes are equitably distributed. Nobody likes to be in the red corner, where performance is poor and there are large social disparities. But you also find some very high-performing countries. You look at Singapore, that do really well on average, but there is still a fairly large gap between socially, economically advantaged and disadvantaged students. And then there are some countries that are seeing their outcomes quite equitably distributed, but at a rather below average overall performance level. So the question that is intriguing all of us is, what are the factors behind those kinds of inequalities in education system? If it would be all about culture and tradition, you'd see that same picture year after year and decade after decade. But what our results actually do show is that some countries have actually made some progress. You see Mexico here, or Slovenia moving rightwards. United States, actually the country with the biggest reduction in social inequalities, Brazil, Chile, Bulgaria, Thailand, Montenegro. So there are some very good examples of countries that in a reasonably short period, we're talking about the gap between 2006 and 2015, have been able to reduce the impact that social background has on learning outcomes, which should us encourage that actually inequality is not intractable. It's something that policy and practice can address. And since the United States was the country with the largest gains, I want to show you that in a little bit more detail. On the vertical axis, again, you see PISA performance, and on the horizontal axis, you see the social background of every school that took place in the United States, and every circle on this chart is a school. So you can see as you move toward more wealthy areas on the right side, school performance tends to be better. As you move to poorer neighborhoods, school performance tends to be lower. So far, so good. But you also see that there are a lot of exceptions from the pattern. It's not that all schools fall on one line, but some schools, under similar circumstances, achieve better results than others. And as I said, the picture's changed. What you see here is 2006. And when I show you the same for 2015, it looked like this. So you actually can see that the relationship between social background and the quality of learning outcomes became weaker. At the top end of the distribution, very little changed, but actually at the low end of the distribution, you saw a big or statistically significant difference. The most disadvantaged students, the most disadvantaged schools were able to see actual improvement. We can also measure this in another statistic that we call student resilience. That's actually the share of students who are in the bottom quarter of the socioeconomic distribution and who still manage to reach the top quarter of the performance outcomes. And it's very impressive. You look at Vietnam here, you know, more than 2/3 of students from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods still can compare with the top quarter of students internationally. Same is true in Macau, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, Japan. So some countries have been very, very good in overcoming, where students have been very good in overcoming social disadvantage, where sort of social mobility is strong. But you look at the other end of the spectrum, you look at the Dominican Republic or Kosovo or Peru, if you come from the poorest quarter of students, your chance to actually make it to the top of the performance distribution is close to zero. That's where poverty becomes destiny. So I think we need to look at this with sort of this huge variability in the capacity of systems to overcome social disadvantage. It's not just, you know, the factors that are driving this. People think first about money, and yes, for low-income countries, money is a big driver of learning outcomes. But as you move, you know, to most of the OECD countries, we have to think much more carefully about the quality of learning environment. I want to illustrate this with a chart that may be actually puzzling you. You know, if I would go into any country that took part in PISA, and I would look at the students who had more learning time and those who had less learning time, then the students who had more hours of instruction or more hours of homework tend to do better. No? That's basically happening within every country. But when I do that across countries, it looks like this. It seems that the more learning time education systems provide, the less well they perform on PISA. I'm not sure we should read too much into the kind of negative relationship, but clearly there doesn't seem to be any kind of positive relationship between learning time and learning outcomes at the cross-country level. Now, within each country, that is still a big predictor. So how can we resolve that puzzle? Well, the answer is that the quality of learning is always the product of the quantity of opportunity, learning time, and the quality of opportunity. Well, that's basically the quality of teaching, the quality of learning. So we need to look much, much harder at the quality of educational opportunities. You can see that clearly when we look at learning time in school and learning time out of school, adding up, you know, there are huge differences in the hours of instruction that students in different education systems get. And when you now relate the volume of time to the learning outcomes, you get a measure of the kind of productivity. Look at Finland. School days are very short. There isn't that much in homework either. Yet, Finland was one of the top performing countries on the PISA test. Germany as well, Switzerland as well, Japan as well. Those countries actually have a high sort of output relative to the time investment they make per student. So something seems to be going well in terms of the quality of learning environment. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, there you can see some countries where learning hours are very high. The United Arab Emirates is a good example, but the quality of learning outcomes is not so strong. So we need to look carefully at the quality of educational opportunities, not just whether students have access to time. And the story about equity is here. It's the same one. You know, it's not sufficient if all students are in schools that have the same number of classes or teachers or, you know, resources. The question is one of the quality of resources, and I'm going to come to this in just a minute. Before I do that, I want to highlight one other dimension. I did this already when we launched the results, and that is it's not just about cognitive outcome. In a field like science, where the last PISA assessment focused on, it's also very important that we look at how students relate to what they learn in terms of their own future, in their own careers. So we ask students what they want to do in their life in terms of, you know, what kind of job also they would want to have at age 30. And this is the share of students who said they want to do something in the field of science. And again, you can see it varies hugely across countries. What's very interesting, you know, look at some of the countries where the share of students aspiring to a science career is lowest. They include countries like Korea, like Japan, like Finland, like the regions in China, or Germany. And if you remember, these countries did actually really, really well on the PISA test. So students did well on PISA, but they don't want to become scientists. Something is going wrong in those education systems. At the same time, you look at the United States, at the other end of the spectrum, students were not so good in science when it comes to the test, but actually they relate well to science and they want to become scientists. So there is something missing in the puzzle that we need to look at. And one of those elements is actually how students enjoy learning about science. Where students do not really enjoy science very much, you can see that the relationship between their performance on the PISA test, this time on the horizontal axis, and their expectation of a science career is not so strong. When students enjoy science moderately or very much, you can see that relationship becomes much more strongly pronounced. So what these data suggest to us is not just about cognitive outcomes, it is also about the social and emotional engagement of students and what they learn. And again, you're going to see that this is something very, very important when it comes to providing equitable opportunities. So, in summary, you have some countries that do really well in science, some countries that have where students have stronger than average belief in science and a method to solve social problems, and some countries where there is an above average percentage of students who want to work in a science-related occupation. You want to be in the center of this, where all of these things align. And there are some countries in that center. Singapore is a great example. The Singaporeans do best on the science test. They relate to science well, and they want to become scientists. In Canada, Slovenia, Australia, UK, Ireland, Portugal is also true, but it is sort of lesser overall level. When you look at Chinese Taipei, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Denmark, these are examples of countries where students do reasonably well on the test. They also believe in science, but they don't want to become scientists. You have a whole list of countries where students do very well on the PISA test, or reasonably well at least, but they do not relate to science. And science is not something they aspire to in their own career. Then you have countries like the United States, like Spain, like Israel, like the United Arab Emirates, where students, believe in science, they want to become scientists, but they are not prepared for it. They do not have the kind of test results that will enable them to live their dreams. And then there is sort of a whole list of countries where students have attitudes that relate to science, but not the preparation for it. So it's important that we keep all of those dimensions in mind when we talk about success in science education. Now, let's focus a little bit more on closing the achievement gap on inequalities. The first question that we can ask is, what share of the performance variation is actually between schools? To what extent does the performance of schools in a country vary? And here you can see in a country like the Netherlands, the provinces in China, the 4 provinces in China, Bulgaria, Hungary, Trinidad and Tobago, Belgium, Slovenia, Germany. Those are countries where actually it matters hugely to what school you go. The average performance of school varies very significantly. Sometimes it's by region, sometimes it's by school type. Whatever the source, there's huge variability in the quality of schooling. On the other end of the spectrum, remember Finland doing really well overall, and at the same time, all schools virtually perform the same. It doesn't matter to what school you send your child, you get a pretty much similar predicted outcome. But we must not forget that often there's a large variability within schools. Often we're not talking about poor schools in poor neighborhoods. No. It's about the success of many students in many classes, in many schools, in many neighborhoods. You can see this here by the long yellow bar. So the inequalities challenges is twofold. First of all, how do we ensure that students have a similar kind of overall level of quality depending on where they go to school? And at the same time, how do teachers and school leaders engage with the diversity of students within their schools? And you can see that there is some degree of trade-off between the two. There is a tendency for countries where there's less variability between schools to see more diversity in their student populations, and countries where there is more stratification, you can see that a little bit more pronounced. There's another way how you can look at this. Here you can see that similar to what I showed you about the United States. On the horizontal axis, again, social background. On the vertical axis, PISA performance. And this is the example of Brazil, where you can also see there is a relationship between social background and performance. The blue dots are private schools. You can see very nicely on this chart that wealthy families tend to buy themselves out of the system, send their children to private schools. They do better, but not better than you would predict by the relationship between social background and learning outcomes. Now, again, people look at this and say, well, you know, so it's really about poverty. But when you compare those results with the results of Vietnam, you can see here the schools are even poorer than the ones in Brazil. And you can see they do a lot better. You compare again, go back to Brazil, and you can see similar schools in a similar context in Vietnam would show a lot better outcomes than the schools in Brazil. And again, it tells us there's a lot that we can do to address variability. Now, one way how we can close the achievement gap is by making sure that students who need the best resources have access to the best resources and the best teachers. But as you can see from this chart, we're still far away from this. You can see that on balance, in the majority of countries, students in disadvantaged schools or schools who are disadvantaged have fewer resources than privileged schools. And it becomes even more pronounced when we talk about the shortage of educational staff. So in most countries, the quality of schools, the infrastructure, the staff resources tend to reinforce inequality in educational opportunity rather than moderate them. Even, you know, the United Kingdom is an interesting example. On the right side, there you can say when it comes to the educational material, the difference is not significant. In fact, it seems rather that, you know, disadvantaged schools have more educational material. But the difference here is not statistically significant, but sort of as a trend. But when you look at the shortage of educational staff, the people, and remember what matters most is the quality of the people. Here you can see that that is on the red side of the chart. So basically disadvantaged schools also in the UK face greater difficulties overcoming educational shortage. One of the drivers that we can see is beyond resources is also the way we organize our education systems. We asked students to what extent they felt well supported by their teachers. And there's a lot of variability between, you know, students, between classes, schools, and so on, as you would expect. You know, teachers might engage very differently with students. But there is an overall pattern that we found. And that is the earlier education systems divide students into different groups, different tracks, different programs, the less supportive they report their teachers to be. It's not so clear what the causal nature of that relationship is. One hypothesis is that when you have more homogeneous classrooms, you know, you tend to teach in a more similar way, a more standardized way, and you worry less about diversity because you see diversity more as a problem of the system or of students being in the wrong track. If you have a more kind of integrated school system, a more comprehensive approach, teachers naturally engage more with diversity and may therefore invest more in individual student support. We do not know, but the pattern is quite pronounced, as you can see in this chart. And last but not least, I also want to show you that we often talk about academic inclusion. The degree to which extent students are academically homogeneous or academically selective. Now, and you can see that here on the horizontal axis. But what is very interesting, when you relate this to the degree to which to what extent schools are socioeconomically inclusive, that's on the vertical axis, you can see that there is a relationship between the two. In other words, where our intention is to be academically selective, we often end up to be socially selective. So the ways in which we organize our education systems, the ways in which we allocate resources, seem to be some of the predictors of the inequality in outcomes and opportunities that we observe on PISA. And with this, I want to just end so that we have sufficient time for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, for your presentation. We will now open the webinar to questions. You are welcome to type your questions into the chat function. We have already received a few questions. The first one is about whether performance is related with discipline, for example, in the Asian countries, and is it less present in Europe, Western Europe? What do you think about that, Andreas?
Yeah, actually, we do find a classroom discipline in general is a good predictor of the quality of the learning environment and also of the outcomes that we observe. The picture between Asia and the West is not so clear. There's a lot of variability across countries, across systems in terms of discipline. It is also very hard to sort of discern whether discipline is an outcome of good quality learning or an input to it. So we know that there is a relationship. That discipline is a very important predictor for learning outcomes, but it's very hard to discern what the causal nature is. And I would be careful in sort of making a east-west divide because we see a lot of variability across countries.
We have somebody who was born in Eastern Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall and then moved to Western Europe for university studies and has experience in working as a teacher on both sides. So this person says that we can understand that the Asiatic countries and Eastern European countries before the fall of the Berlin Wall were very interested in science and well prepared and determined to study. This person would like to know whether it's related to the culture of the country.
I think in the case of Eastern Europe, and it's held true also for countries like Korea, traditionally science has been a big policy priority. I think this is something that was built in the instructional system. There was a strong emphasis on science, scientific excellence. So it may be an attribute of culture, but I do think it's more an attribute of policy. The reason I'm saying this also is because those things change over time. When you look at science graduates over time, you can see some huge fluctuations, and the relative competitiveness of science and engineering. So I think maybe an attribute of culture, but I do think that this is an area where policy can make a big difference, not just in science performance, but also in strengthening attitudes and minimizing gender differences. Many of the stereotypes that we're seeing on the PISA outcomes when it comes to, science attitudes of boys and girls may be attributable to, how we as parents speak with our children about this, how teachers relate to those kinds of school subjects. So I think there's a lot that public policy can do, and I think Eastern Europe is a great illustration where they made it a priority and became very good at it.
Another question, do Asian countries do better because students spend more time learning?
Well, as I showed, the outcomes are the product of the quantity of learning and the quality of learning. And yes, within a country, you can argue that more time will lead to better results. And clearly, the East Asian countries put a lot of volume into instruction, maybe with the exception of Japan. At the very same time, you can also see some countries with a much less volume, like Finland, like Estonia, achieving superb results. So I think we should look at least as much at the quality of instruction than simply at the hours students spend.
Few countries have been able to reconcile equity with more quality. Studies seem to affirm a positive correlation between equity and quality. What are the elements that support this thesis?
Well, I think the bottom line is you do not achieve a very strong overall performance in the education system if there's a long trail of underperforming students. So the focus on equity is a good way to raise overall quality. It's also a good way to raise excellence, because if the pool of students from which you can draw your top performers becomes too small, for example, because the education system is too selective, too track, or has too many underperformers, it is very difficult to achieve a high group of high-performing school systems. But there is more to this. It's simply also having universal educational expectations. If an education system expects all of its students to succeed, if an education system instills among students that success is not about where I come from, but about the effort that I invest, they will overall achieve much better results. And last but not least, our data show clearly that the relative returns on investment are highest in the disadvantaged students. So if we align the resources that we spend with the needs of students in schools, we will use our resources not only most accurately, but also most efficiently. So the kind of positive trend is not so much a surprise when you think about this carefully.
Another question, what can a country like Spain or the United States learn from a system like Singapore, which is a small city-state?
Well, you know, I think the United States has many small cities of the size of Singapore. You know, I think actually there's a lot of learning because many of the large cities in the United States are particularly challenged when it comes to good learning outcomes. So perhaps that's where the opportunities for exchange are strongest. I mean, part of it comes down to the way the work of teachers is being organized. If you look to the United States, the focus on rather small classes has come at the expense of, you know, paying teachers competitively. Singapore pays its teachers clearly better. Singapore also gives its teachers a lot more time to do other things than teaching. There's more investment in the professional development of teachers, much more investment in teacher collaboration. Teachers would typically observe each other's classrooms once per week. They would participate in teacher competitions. A strong emphasis on human resources. There are much more interesting career opportunities for teachers in Singapore. So I think it's a good example where a country like the United States could learn a lot, or at least many of the urban areas in the United States could learn a lot. And I think the same is true for a country like Spain.
We have somebody from the Dominican Republic who has asked a question, and this person is now a PhD student at Stanford. Clearly, the results are scary for the Dominican Republic. What would you consider the major challenges for the country, and what are the major factors contributing to such a low performance for the country, and how does it compare with previous PISA rounds?
This is the first time that we have data for the Dominican Republic, so I can't report on trends. But I would agree that the Dominican Republic is seriously challenged in this. It's obviously a country that has very unequal distribution of economic resources and income. In that sense, sort of, you would not expect very, very strong results, but at least you would expect that the families that you know, have reasonably high levels of income and the schools where those students go would show good results. And that's perhaps the biggest surprise to me, that even under relatively favorable condition in the Dominican Republic, results are still lower than you would expect. So I think these data are a very clear signal. You know, it's perhaps not fair to compare the Dominican Republic with, you know, other countries that are much better positioned economically. But clearly, if students want to be competitive internationally in the Dominican Republic, significant educational improvement is imperative.
Do you see any impact of the use of new tools such as online learning and teaching?
That's difficult to assess. In fact, you know, we could not detect any positive impact from the data that we have in PISA, but we do not know to what extent that is due to the quality of those kinds of environments, to the way in which they're deployed by teachers. As a general rule, it seems that technology can enhance good teaching, but technology is rarely a replacement for poor teaching. And often, you know, we put too much emphasis on digital infrastructures, technology, before education systems put in place the kind of human capacity to make good use out of this. But we did publish a report to computers and students and computers based on the 2012 cycle that went into this in a little bit more detail. But the results that we find now are very much the same.
Is there a relationship between inequality in learning outcomes and social mobility?
Yeah, I think in the sense that if resilience is low, that is, few students that are disadvantaged have a chance to achieve very strong educational outcomes, their life opportunities will be seriously curtailed. We know that the link between skills and earnings is very strong. We can skills with employment, but also to important social outcomes like trust, like political efficacy, like health of people. So yeah, I think those unequal distribution of learning opportunities raises huge barriers for subsequent social mobility.
And a related question, for countries that don't have enough resources to promote both equity and quality, what should they give priority to, quality or equity?
Well, this is the point I think that our data make, that trade-off between quality and equity is far from obvious. I think the resources that we invest in the students that have the potential but do not come from the most privileged backgrounds, those resources are generally best invested, and they are raising the equity and educational opportunities and also the quality of learning outcomes. So, in fact, equitable investment is not only leading to more equitable outcomes, but also to more efficient outcomes. I do not deny that countries have to make tough choices at some point, but I don't think we should make them and frame them in terms of quality, equity outcomes. I give you an example. For example, if you look to the 4 provinces in China that took part in the PISA assessment, they do not have favorable resources. Some of these provinces, the province of Guangdong has the level of GDP per capita of Mexico, but they distribute their resources very, very differently than is the case in Mexico. You can see, for example, that they would typically have very large classes, but that allows them to invest in very high quality level teachers. They're also better in attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. So I think there's a lot we can learn from some of the, maybe economically less developed regions in terms of how they achieve quality and a more equitable distribution of learning outcomes.
And what about pre-primary education? Can that help to close the achievement gap?
Yes, indeed. In fact, we have very interesting analysis on this, where basically you can say that the more exposure to a pre-primary education is clearly associated with better results at age 15 on the PISA test. But again, when you look at opportunities, unfortunately, what our data show is that students from less privileged backgrounds often have fewer years in pre-primary education than students who come from wealthier families. So again, in principle, early education could be a huge equalizer, but in practice, it often reinforces educational inequalities.
And what about grade repetition? Does that help or harm struggling students?
I think the answer to that is fairly clear, not just from this PISA assessment, but from previous ones as well. Grade repetition does not lead to better results. It's basically a highly ineffective policy. It tends to reinforce social disparities. There's a clear link between the incidence of grade repetition and the impact which social background has on learning outcomes. And we take 2 students with the same PISA scores, and the more disadvantaged students will be much more likely to be repeating a grade than the privileged student. In countries like Spain, that's obvious. You talk about, almost 5-fold relationship. But perhaps most importantly, it's also stigmatizing, and it's very expensive. A grade repeater costs the society in the OECD area about, 30,000 to 40,000 euro. Because those students will enter the labor market 1 year later, they'll contribute less social contributions. So there's a huge price that not only individuals pay, but also society. Imagine we would invest those resources in, helping struggling students succeed, intervening earlier. And that's exactly what high-performing education systems often do. If you look to Finland, for example, 30% of instruction time is delivered outside the classroom setting. So schools have plenty of opportunities to identify, diagnose early disadvantage, early underperformance, and intervene to make sure that students do not need to repeat their school.
Do you see with higher performing students within countries, do they do better where the education system is academically selective?
That's an interesting question. I mean, that's a question we have often asked ourselves. We know that selection is not leading to inclusion, but will it strengthen excellence? And it's very hard to answer with this kind of cross-sectional data. But what is interesting, you can look at some of the countries that do particularly well on excellence. Take Japan, take Finland, and they are typically still comprehensive education systems, fairly inclusive in their approach. They can draw their highly talented from a large kind of pool of potential applicants. Some of the most selective education systems are not so strong at the top. I hesitate to draw sort of a clear line here because we have exceptions. Germany, for example, is a highly stratified education system and is doing quite well among the top performing students. But overall, I think what I can say is that selection is not associated in general with more excellence in the system or a greater share of high-performing students.
The OECD often talks about selecting the best students into the teaching profession, but how can the quality of teaching improve once they are in the teaching profession?
I think that's actually a very, very important question. In fact, one of the things that we often say is that what happens after teachers enter the classroom is far more important than what happens before they are trained. And that's one of the things where we see some of the highest performing education systems make huge investments. Particularly Singapore, Japan, the East Asian countries, they make in Singapore, you'd spend 100 hours every year, every teacher, to upgrade your knowledge, to contribute to the profession, to contribute to your own career, but also to that of your colleagues. So many of these countries make huge investments in upgrading, in continued professional development, in mentorships, in all of those kinds of arrangements.
A question about the UK planning to allow new selective schools to be opened. Is there any evidence to support selection based on performance of students at age 11 from PISA?
Cross-national data do not allow to make such an inference. Basically, we do not see any systemic advantage of a more selective school system. In fact, to be frank, so far the UK is not a very selective school system when it comes to selection decisions made by schools. It is a very selective system when you look at what happened inside schools. So the issue in the UK is not so much grammar schools or selective schools. The biggest challenge for the UK is to make the school system less selective when students are inside the school. But we can't say that, putting more emphasis on selection has much promise in raising overall performance and so on.
We have a question about science. What makes science interesting to students, and how do teachers do this? Does
it's a good question.
Data say anything on this?
Yeah. It's a good question, and perhaps one where we need to actually invest a lot more in our studies. So far, we only see that the engagement, interest, and enjoyment of students in science varies hugely within countries, varies hugely across countries, and the cross-country variation encourages us to think about the systemic answers. If it would be just, variability among students, you might think, well, that's something that's very particular to the interest of a student. But the fact that we do see cross-country variation is encouraging. What relates to this? Much more difficult to say. One thing is that where we looked at teaching practices that struck me is that some of the more innovative teaching practices, like inquiry-based learning, for example, did not relate to better outcomes overall. We can't say this. In fact, often the more traditional teaching practices, teacher-directed teaching practices, seem to be associated with better outcomes. But what is interesting is when you look at enjoyment of science, that's where those kinds of more practice-oriented science teaching actually seem to lead to higher levels of student interest and engagement. So, but again, this is something where we are at the very beginning, but I do think it's a very important question to discuss.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I'm not seeing any more questions coming from the participants. So if the participants do have more questions, you're welcome to submit them by sending an email to edu.contact@oecd.org, and we will be happy to answer them. In the new year, we are planning to host more webinars in different time zones so that you can have more questions answered by the PISA team, and we look forward to having you on further webinars. Thank you for your attention, and this PowerPoint will be uploaded to our website, and you will receive a notification of the URL.